So I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer. I'm the director of Laasok. Laasok is a virtual liberal Beit Midrash. It's a community of learners who come together to connect with our Judaism and with each other by doing that most basic of Jewish acts, that most fundamental of Jewish acts, studying our sacred texts, and doing so in an inclusive and progressive environment. For those of you who are new to this community, welcome. For those who've studied with Laasok before, and I see lots of you, welcome back. This Social Justice in Our Text series is an expression of our mission of empowering liberal Jews to own their Judaism through study and finding modern meaning in our sacred texts. So throughout this year, we're meeting about once a month to explore various aspects of what Jewish tradition has to say about creating a just society. I'm very grateful to all of our partner organizations, and I want to name them now. All of those organizations who have helped make this series happen. And they are the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR Press, Tzedek Box, Dayenu, Jewish Call for Climate Justice, the Union for Reform Judaism, Kirva, Keeping It Sacred, Central Synagogue, Temple Israel of Greater Miami, and Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I also want to lift up today the Reformed Jewish Community of Canada, which is a wing of the Union for Reform Judaism. And our teacher, Rabbi Dara Lithwick, is associated with the Reformed Jewish Community of Canada in ways that I'll talk about in just a moment. I want to convey deep, deep thanks to two individuals, members of the Laasok community, for helping make this program happen today. And they are Robert Goldman and Lauren Davis, both of whom are here with us today. As well to all of you who've made contributions to help support this program. Thank you for being here and thanks for making this happen. If you would like to support Laasok, you can do so at the link that I'll just throw into the chat right now. Make a tax-deductible donation to Laasok, and we are grateful for all of your support. As we did last time, I want to start by turning things over for a minute to Rabbi Andrew Kaplan-Mandel, who represents two of our partners, Central Synagogue and Tzedek Box, to help us set an intention for this study. So Rabbi Kaplan-Mandel, take it away.
Thank you so much. As with our last Laasok gathering, in advance of further study, we're going to take a moment to reflect on the actions that we've taken in the past month to try to improve our world. So I invite you to find a slip of paper, to jot down something that you did, maybe how you felt, maybe what impact you hope it had on the world, maybe what it makes you want to do more of. I had the chance to knock on doors to get out the vote in Philadelphia on a beautiful fall day last week, and it made me want to talk to more of my fellow Americans about the country that we want to live in. So I'll give us all a little bit of music while we write. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 yada dai yada dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yada dai yada da 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 da. Yada dai dai dai. Yai dai 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 da 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 da. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yada dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. And you can finish up your slip of paper when you're ready. You can put it in a tzedek box, which you can make out of a tissue box or a jar or a cigar box, and which you will be invited to open on Pesach Sheni in May. Thanks so much.
All right, that was a beautiful nigun. I'm going to need to find out later what nigun that was. so that I can learn it. Thank you, Rabbi Andrew Kaplan Mandel. I now want to introduce our speaker and turn things over to her. Rabbi Dara Lithwick, one of my favorite teachers in the world, is passionate about building bridges between people and communities and promoting inclusion as a fundamental Jewish practice. She is an advocate for 2S LGBTQ2I plus inclusion within diverse Jewish spaces, as well as for Jewish inclusion within 2S LGBTQ2I plus spaces. At work, in her real job, as a constitutional and parliamentary affairs lawyer, Rabbi Dara serves on her employer's diversity council and leads positive spaces training workshops. In the community, she's active at Temple Israel Ottawa, leading services and teaching, as well as Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom in Montreal, where she teaches Introduction to Judaism courses in English and French. Rabbi Dara is also the chair of the Tikkun Olam Steering Committee at the Reformed Jewish Community of Canada, currently focused on creating a Canadian version of the popular Letaken social justice seminar by the Union for Reform Judaism's Religious Action Center. And I know that that's happening this year for the first time. So go, Rabbi Dara. She is a member of the URJ, Union for Reform Judaism's Commission on Social Action, as well as the New Israel Fund of Canada's Clergy Advisory Committee. In the winter, Rabbi Dara and her partner love schlepping their kids around the National Capital Region's ski hills, where Dara serves as a volunteer ski patroller, keeping a watchful eye as kids race downhill skiing. Couple of technical notes. We are going to ask you to stay muted during the session, but we do intend this to be interactive. So if you have comments or thoughts to share, please raise your hand electronically or put them into the chat, and Rabbi Dara will keep an eye on the electronic hand raise, and I will keep an eye on the chat. At this time, I want to just invite you to join me in the blessing for study. So I'm going to share my screen, if you'll join me in this blessing, and then we'll jump right into our study. And we can say together, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu v'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal one, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. And without any further ado, I'll turn things right over now to Rabbi Dara Lithwick.
Thank you so much, and shalom. It is wonderful. Shalom, I say shalom, bonjour, hello. It's wonderful to be here. I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And there's a lot of work to do there, and there's a lot of work on engagement to do in that regard. And I see from like where everybody says they're from. I mean, we're really from all over. Including I saw Europe and South Africa, and a lot of us in the States, and some of us here in Canada. And so for the next 50 minutes or so, we'll talk about what's so Jewish about civic engagement and really get into voting. What's so Jewish about voting? And I'm not the only rabbi at all to have written about this, to have done things about this. A good friend of mine, Rabbi David Evan Marcus, did his we studied together at Aleph, did his senior tshuva on Jewish obligations of voting. I followed a couple years later doing a senior tshuva on a similar subject, because here in Canada, I mean, voting is an interesting, voting is accessible and things like that, but when elections happen, in our fixed election date laws, which are not really fixed election date laws because we're still a parliamentary system and there's still confidence conventions and things like that. I won't get into this. But in Canada, oftentimes a federal or provincial election can take place in the fall. And if it takes place in the fall, it will likely take place on or around a Jewish holiday. And that's what happened in the federal election of 2019. It was on Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah. And so, so then I was asking the question and answering the question, could we see voting as a positive mitzvah, as a positive obligation? And to the extent that, if that was the only day available to vote, if you couldn't vote early or do anything like that, how would we square that with the with the negative obligations surrounding a chag, in terms of abstaining from certain things. But over the course of that, again, building on some other rabbis, and I have sources, I have a presentation that I'm about to share, the PowerPoint, and there's sources at the end, like for further reading or that sort of thing. So there's some other snazzy opportunities there, and I think we could share the PowerPoint probably thereafter as a PDF, and then that way, if anybody wants it, they can have those sources accessible to you. So without further ado, I shall share and see, sharing my screen. There we go. Okay, do we see it? Yes. Awesome. Okay. So what's so Jewish about civic engagement? The short answer on regel echad, on one leg, a lot. But we'll go into a little bit more depth, because I know, wait, I feel like there's a big election coming up next week somewhere south of me. I mean, look, the whole world is watching with bated breath, I think, what's going to happen next week. But also, interestingly, in Canada, yesterday, the Premier of Nova Scotia went to dissolved the legislature in Nova Scotia and called an election for November 26th. We just had an election just over a week ago in British Columbia, and also just last week in New Brunswick. So we're expecting elections still to come up. Plus, at the federal level, I don't know if anybody's following the news here in Canada, but we have a minority parliament here in Canada, and there had been a supply and confidence agreement between the governing Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party. That agreement is no longer in effect, so we'll see how long the 44th Parliament of Canada lasts. So we could be in an election, in theory, anytime here too. All right, so what's so Jewish about civic engagement? A lot. Let's unpack that. Okay, so let's go back to the sources, what I like to call the Torah of voting. Okay, so Jewish tradition, and these are, I mean, if you have there are many other ways we could look at this too, and but Jewish tradition views us working in partnership with God, however we envision God, to create a better world, like as we pray in the Aleinu prayer, Letaken Olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair the world, or to heal the world, in a vision of divine rulership or glory or things like that. Torah calls on us to pursue justice, to care for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, and to sustain our world. And we often hear the phrases, particularly in progressive circles, of tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, for Deuteronomy. And there's a lot of commentary on why does it repeat itself, tzedek, tzedek. And some interpretations say it's repeated because to put extra emphasis. Others say the repetition is there so to emphasize that we are to pursue justice justly. So there's a vehicle, a means, and again, thinking about our civic engagement, that we are to pursue justice in a way that upholds justice too. So it's not about the ends justifying the means. It's about, the means having to be just as well. We're taught also in Deuteronomy, like from Nitzavim, like favorite passages, to choose life so that you and your children may live. And choosing life is a positive action, conveying that we have to make choices to create the world that we want to live in. And voting is very much an example of making a choice. And sort of thinking about it, voting is more than just a civic duty. It's really a key expression of our relationship to each other and to our organized society. And we have a protected right to vote. And this has been such of concern and debate and litigation too. I'd say more so in the States than in Canada, but also in Canada in terms of how do we fulfill this right to vote? What does it mean to have a right to vote, and how do we ensure that everybody has a right to vote? But also, like, thinking about the flip side of the right to vote is that it's a responsibility
Oh my God.
for us to exercise that right. All right. Go to the next. Oop, let me go back. There. Okay. So Torah teaches us that we as Jews are to engage also in the communities in which we live. And even in biblical Israel, there's a divine injunction to treat all people residing in the land alike with one law for all. As read in Leviticus, in Vayikra, you shall have one law for the stranger and the citizen alike, for I, Adonai, am your God. And it's also clear that the requirement for civic engagement applies not just to our Jewish communities, but to society writ large. The prophet Jeremiah Yirmiyahu wrote that we are to engage deeply in the communities where we find ourselves, to build houses and to put down roots. And to quote, and this is a quote often used around really the obligation that we have to be involved in the communities where we live, not just the Jewish communities, but in civic society more broadly. Seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to God on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. So this is prosper, because this is, Jeremiah, the prophet Yirmiyahu, speaking from the time of the Babylonian exile, and already there really, indicating that wherever you find yourselves, there is a duty and an import to engage in the society where we live. Okay. Let's go. There we go. Okay. So let's see then how the rabbis have addressed this. The Mishnah and the Talmud go even further, and really, if you go to Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our teachers, again, fabulous life lessons in there. Rabbi Hillel said, "Do not separate yourself from the community." In other words, we are to be engaged, and we have a collective duty to society. And the Talmud unpacks this further. I mean, there's no Talmud, there's no Gemara of Pirkei Avot itself. So, again, Mishnah redacted between, let's say, the second and third, early fourth centuries of the Common Era. Then the Gemara up through the 8th century, commentary on the Mishnah. There's no Gemara corresponding exactly to Pirkei Avot, but the Talmud unpacks this elsewhere, like in Bava Batra, which is part of the whole debate around, or the whole collection of corpus of law around damages, that this requirement, do not separate yourself from the community, requires all residents, for example, to pay into taxes for digging new cisterns and the building and upkeep of the city gates, and so on. Elsewhere in the Talmud also, can't remember exactly where, but there's fabulous, again, elements on, when you think about civic engagement, elements on like the requirements of having like public school, and on what age should kids be in school, and how many kids should be in a class, and all that sort of stuff. So there's really, again, unpacking of what does building a society where people are responsible for each other and to each other engaged in. Micah?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the Jeremiah passage that you put up a minute ago, that the moment in time where Jeremiah is living is the moment of just after the Babylonian exile. In fact, during, right? Like these are people who have just found themselves in a new society. They were immigrants. They were newcomers to this society where they found themselves, and they're asking what is, I think, a serious question. Do we dig in here or not? Do we we're longing to go home. We're longing to go back to where we were exiled from. And so to us, maybe it's obvious that you're supposed to engage in whatever society you live in because we live mostly in North America. We live in democratic societies. But I just think it's sort of worth punctuating that in a moment where that was not clear, where people weren't sure whether they should really focus on living where they lived or not, the prophet Jeremiah comes along and says, yes, eventually the Messiah will come and we'll all go home. But right now, right here, right now, it's important to live where you are and to really be engaged in creating a just society here and now.
I think that's a really important point in terms of dealing with change and major disruption, and innovation through disruption. I mean, there's a great teaching from late Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, who would often teach that about our tradition, about Judaism, at its best, that it is, to use a computer analogy, forward-looking and backwards compatible. And we think about the Judaism that we practice and the varieties of Judaism that we practice and how different it is, obviously, from Temple Judaism, not at all alike, and the evolution in tradition that happened over time with the disruption, that happened with the first and second exiles and thereafter, and just the transformation from being a temple cult to prayer, to how we express ourselves through prayer and how we connect in community, with the Beit Midrash and the synagogue becoming locusts, becoming, the foundations of communal organization, which was happening even, around the turn of the first century too, and even before, in terms of places of teaching and learning and how ideas were shared, and things debated, but how those things, what changed and what grew over time. And for Jeremiah, exactly, and to have this part of our biblical canon, as part of the Nevi'im, as part of the prophets, that, this statement, about being involved in the places where we live while we're in exile, not just to be, not just to be forlorn or to just turn purely inward, but to be engaged in civic society, is huge. And I think set a path, that enables also like a healthy relationship with our Judaism and, with the center, how we define it in different ways, if that makes sense. So yes, like having this duty to society, and for upkeep of society, that includes but isn't limited to just our immediate family or just our immediate Jewish community. So let's see where else this takes us. Let's see how much further this takes us. And this is again from Bava. This is again from Bava Batra. A little more on unpacking. Do not separate yourself from the community. And this is a pretty famous passage. You might have come across this before. It was taught, and this is from page folio 8a, verse 15. It was taught, one must dwell in a place 30 days before giving to the soup kitchen, 3 months for the charity fund, 6 months for clothing, 9 months for burial, 12 months for paying taxes. And so it also shows what does it mean to be, how we get involved in being a part of community, and how responsibilities start to, we start to incur responsibilities as we move to a new place and get involved. Avin, something else to say about this, but D Moore, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to note on the way past how practical and nitty-gritty they are. Like, I love the fact that it's like, it's the charity fund, it's the clothing, it's these specific actions. I think we often get trapped in the grand ideas, and Baba Batra here is guiding us to say, well, look after the small, look after the little bit.
Exactly the tachlis, like the practical, you know.
Yeah.
Beautiful observation. And I would say in this regard 100%. And you know, newcomers to a community are to take on different stack obligations that increase the more the new resident becomes settled, from supporting the soup kitchen through paying taxes. And it's so there, and it's so it's very much along the lines. There was a book that the late Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote called The Home We Build Together. And in that book, The Home We Build Together, he wrote, you know, there are different ways of looking at society and the social contract and things like that. And some places address, you know, society as, what were the analogies he used? He used the analogy of a hotel, and he used the analogy of a country club that we versus the home that we build together. So the hotel analogy is our relationship with society or with the state is purely transactional. It's like we pay to stay in a hotel. We expect, you know, that the room will be clean, that there will be the little, you know, soap and shampoo and that sort of thing. We have where to sleep, and maybe there's a hot breakfast, and maybe it's extra. You know, at the country club, we have to be let in, you know, and then it's the membership is very particular. And if anybody's let in, if you're bringing a guest in, it's like you never really feel like you belong, because, you know, if you're, you know, guest of somebody's at a country club, it's like it's very clear that you don't belong there. And both these models of society and of building a multicultural society are flawed. And the way that we should look at it, and the way that our tradition looks at it, is of the home that we build together, that this is a joint project. And when we're involved in doing things together, when we get involved, and this is where it's also brilliant, this tachlis stuff, like that you were talking about here in Bava Batra, the way it's so practical, it enables people to be involved and become a part of the community from the get-go. And in that sense, to have that, I mean, there's the practical element, but also to have that sense of belonging, and have that belonging deepen as they stay in the community, as they're able to get more involved and get more settled, that they're not just a newcomer, not just a guest, but they're a part of the community. I just see there are comments coming up, but I can't see all the comments because I'm presenting. So I just want to.
Let me read one of them if it's helpful,
Okay.
because it's a question that's being raised to what you're saying now.
Sure.
Somebody said, here it is. Trisha said, it occurred to me that there's a risk in becoming so involved in the society we are in that we may assimilate too much and lose our sense of ourselves as Jews and neglect our own practices and rituals, or maybe neglect our own community, our sort of, how do you balance the outward looking and the inward lookingness?
Fantastic question. This is also something, I mean, it's going a little bit off the path, but it's still very much focused on what we're talking about today. And it's a great question. This is sort of what's coming right to my head in terms of how I've seen this addressed. In our tradition is, if you think, first of all, I mean, our tradition is good at, I feel like our tradition is good at dialectical thinking, like able to hold, you know, the ability to hold multiple strands together, multiple things together. And, you know, we have the famous, you know, it became Song of the Pardoner. If I am, you know, also Hillel teaching, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And yet if I'm only for myself, who am I? So really like balancing that it's not just about me, it's not just about the other, but really it's about finding a healthy equilibrium, a healthy dynamic balance. You know, also in the teaching, was it like Reb Bunam or whatever, you know, the teaching that in one, you know, that you have you know, the piece of paper in each pocket, you know, one piece of paper in each of your two pockets, and one says, you know, the whole world was created for me, and in the other one it says, you know, I'm nothing but dust and ashes. And again, this ability to sort of find that balance. What that balance looks like will vary. And our tradition, I'd say not but and like our, what that balance is will vary. And how that balance is determined will, is a personal, in some ways, a personal determination and a communal one as well. But I think it's important to keep that tension in mind. Steve.
I was muted, sorry. I was also noting in these various activities being listed here that there's an increasing, it seems almost an increasing financial obligation as you go forward. In other words, paying taxes is a lot more difficult financially than, let's say, clothing, perhaps. I'm not sure about the logic, but that's what hit me. And then I went back, I turned that in reverse and said, if something is the least burdensome financially, I'm looking at giving to the soup kitchen, which in my mind could be donating food, but it could also mean, I guess, working in the soup kitchen. That there's some kind of structure being set out here as well, that there are things that anyone can do to improve the world, regardless of their circumstance.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Sherry or Sherry? I don't want to mispronounce your name.
Hey, Sherry, thank you. So the other thing that when I look at what this section is calling out, it is civic stuff.
Yeah.
It's right, it's the soup kitchen, it's the charity fund. None of it is religious. And historically, Jews have said when there's an occupying party, has said, yeah, we'll pay your taxes, like we'll follow these civil rules, these civic rules. And then when the controlling group says, oh yeah, we want you to bow down to our gods, that's always been when the Jews have said, no, thank you, but not so much, right? Yeah. So it seems like we're educated and well versed in keeping this separation, at least if you look historically. I don't know if we succeed as much today just because of the way that the world is, but certainly historically, like I feel like we were always pretty clear. And if you look at this section, it's pretty clear. It's all civic stuff. Yeah. None of it has to do with the core of, it has to do with who we are, because we're supposed to be civic minded and Tikkun Olam and all of that, right? So it is about who we are, but it's not, none of this is in, what's the word I'm looking for? None of it comes up against who we are, right? None of it is asking that. None of it is saying, oh, and after a year and a half, you go to their church.
Yeah, exactly. None of this is about giving up any of what it means to be Jewish at all. This is part of what it means to be Jewish.
And these are all things that are important in Judaism. So I want to bring that up.
Right. Thank you. I'd say Rabbi Micah, and then...
Yeah, a little bit related to what Sherry just said. I was thinking, I wonder if the paradigm of inward versus outward is the wrong paradigm, because Rabbi Dara, you just said, these are Jewish acts. Right. Yes. So this is how you engage Jewishly, in part by engaging in your society. So to think, that this is going to cause us to lose our Jewishness. Actually, this is a feature of our Jewishness. It's not the only. Your Jewishness can't only be social justice, but by the same token, your Jewishness can't only be praying in Hebrew in the synagogue, because Judaism demands a just society at the same time. So I think this is Jewish versus this being something that's, separate from or somehow anathema to, or dangerous isn't quite the right word, but sort of like that we have to balance with our Jewishness.
Yeah. And I managed to see one comment, I think from Paula, that Bava Batra is assuming you're in a Jewish community. That you are assuming that this is part of being in wherever your community, wherever it is in civil, whatever it is in greater society, and that's the case too. And exactly, being Jewish also means being Jewish also means contributing to the soup kitchen and paying tax, and paying into the community in different ways, into society. Peter and Joy.
And yes, it's both of us. I just have a very brief comment, which is, can't all of this be summed up with the overarching rule that says civil law it takes precedence over religious law? And what I mean by that, and I think what that means, is all of what you've got on the screen. All of that is part of quote unquote civil law, looking after, paying taxes, burying the dead. All of that is part of civil law, and as I see it anyway. And Joy wanted to make a comment as well.
Rabbi, I'm having great difficulty reconciling this. Engaging in communities where we are not the only community, we're multicultural, and yet that community ends up putting us into ghettos, as has happened over centuries.
Okay, so I think that goes, thank you for your question and your comment. And I think, again, like this goes sort of to what Paula was saying before. This is in terms of, probably originally speaking to, we're talking about different sources to pull together around an obligation to vote. The connective piece, I think what Peter was saying, this is all under sort of being involved, and there's the idea of, that comes across a lot in the Talmud too, regarding civil law, dina de malchuta dina. The civil law, generally the civil law is the law. So we're to follow whatever the civil, whatever the grand civil laws. Again, this here in terms of the soup kitchen, the charity fund, clothing, burial, paying tax, much of this would be within the Jewish community. Dina de malchuta dina, though, civil society. And then what is the line there, though, in terms of where it compromises, and this is back to an earlier comment, where it compromises core, our core Judaism, or asks us to set aside an element of what, you're allowed to belong if you disavow Judaism, or if you disavow this, or if you do that, or being ghettoized. Now, in terms of ghettos too, I'm not going to go too deep into that involvement about, because I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had there. But in terms of on the one hand, you see the capacity of the Jewish community, even in very harsh circumstances, to survive, and to survive through practical care of civic elements, even in the face of discrimination and oppression. But that does not forgive the discrimination or oppression, or make the discrimination or oppression okay. Like that's definitely does not make the discrimination and oppression okay. And then they're still working for changing law, which we're going to get to in terms of how do we deal with government, how do we deal with the law, how do we deal with the majority. And I know it's already 3:40, so I'm going to take one more comment from Paula, and then we'll keep going, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. So I'm assuming that any of this that we're talking about, and our involvement and engagement in the community, is assuming that there's a certain kind of freedom that we have. Because under oppression, I think that a lot of this would be stated in a kind of a different way. But for those who are concerned about involving in Jewish communities, the Talmud also tells us that we shouldn't live in a place where we can't get kosher food, or that we should have a schoolhouse, or that we need a doctor. So that we need to have a cemetery, a mitzvah, which is a very important part of Jewish life. So I think that what this is indicating is that there are things both specifically involved in ritual, and things that are generally needed in a community.
Beautiful.
That when Jews are free to live someplace that is not specifically in a Jewish area, that these are the things that you have to do. And I think I want to echo Micah saying that all of this is Jewish. And
yeah,
I think our rabbis don't make so much of a separation between the ritual and the ethical or the civic responsibilities.
Beautiful. Beautiful. No, thank you. And agreed, so in terms of what, in terms of living in shared society and building community, there's a lot there in the Talmud. But let's get a little spicier. Let's turn to government and see some of what our sages have said in that regard. Because we also have, let me see if I can go to the next slide. So pray for the welfare of the government. Oy vey. Yes, no, it's important to pray for the welfare of the government. And this is also Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Hanina, the vice high priest, said, pray for the welfare, shloma, like shlemut from shalom, so whole, welfare, also wholeness of the government of Malchut. Were it not for the fear it inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive. And I apologize, there's the American spelling here, because with the neighbor, in Canada, we'd have a U. There's, pray for the well. So this is, quite a statement. Otherwise, it sounds a little bit mixed at first blush. For were it not for the fear it inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive. So, some centuries later, Rabbeinu Yonah, a 13th century Spanish rabbi and Talmudist and ethicist, explained this passage in the following way to emphasize the importance of Jews praying for the welfare of all people. And it's a fascinating interpretation. So it's specifically focused on the man would swallow his fellow alive. This matter is wanting to say that a person should pray for the peace of the whole world and be in pain about the pain of others, as a person should not make his supplications and his requests for his needs alone, but rather to pray for all people that they be at peace. As with the welfare of the government, there is peace in the world. And so this is like an incredibly, this is in the 1200s. This is an incredibly deep, rich statement about healthy society and having a civic government, like a civil government that takes the needs of all of its, diverse citizens into account. And it makes sense when you think about context. Going back to what Rabbi Streifer was talking about earlier, say thinking about where Jeremiah was at the time. Here, thinking about where Rabbeinu Yonah was at the time, thinking about Spain, Spain, particularly between the 9th and the 12th, early 13th century until stuff started to go downhill. Fabulous example also of, first of all, you had Jewish engagement at the highest levels of society in terms of involvement under the Islamic rule of the time. This is the golden age of Spain. I mean, we're at the end of the golden age of Spain here. Where again you had where you had a pretty diverse society, and so this thinking is makes sense too in that regard. And I mean, even just looking at it on its face, the idea of having a functioning government is important for having a functioning society at its most basic. I see them I'm just briefly going to the chat. May God keep the Tsar, the blessing in Fiddler. May God keep the Tsar far, far away from us. Yeah, and it is a balancing act, right? In terms of how things ought to be, how things versus how things sometimes are, and what we need at different times. Dee?
Just another observation on the way past. Something that I love from Rabbeinu Yonah is the idea of holding the pain. So often we intellectualize these things, and yeah, I think that there's a lot of utility to be had to say we should first be in pain about the pain of others, as he says. That's so beautiful to me.
Like a deep empathy.
That Yeah, that's the basis. Like that's where we start.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Wow. So to sort of continue on a little bit later, so now we're going late Middle Ages, maybe early, we're getting closer to the Enlightenment. So peace and good government. In the 16th century, Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Heller wrote about Malchut. Also, again, we're still interpreting that sentence in Pirkei Avot, saying that Malchut in Pirkei Avot is meant to include the whole of the government, leadership and advisors. Malchut, that means the king and his ministers and his advisors who run his kingdom and administer law in the land. And that is why it did not say for the welfare of the melech, like of the king itself. So, and then later, later on, there's also the 18th century biblical commentator known as the MitzVOTE David added that praying for peace for the political leadership, again, now we're heading into different type of government is good because it will then bring peace back to you. And again, I think that's that mirror there. We're heading into more, more of a contemporary frame of a healthy government is good for the population, writ large. And again, you had that expansion already in the 16th century about, thinking about it's not just a king, but really it's the whole apparatus of government getting in there. Okay. So this brachot, first book of the Talmud, and here we get sort of some of the basis around voting or expressing popular will. So from Talmud Brachot 55a, Rabbi Yitzchak said, one may only appoint a community if he consults with the community and they agree to the appointment. The proof text given here is a statement from Exodus, which interprets, and this is about Betzalel's appointment in terms of the Mishkan, and the Talmud passage actually continues interpreting the passage in a midrash whereby God seeks the people's opinion to confirm the leadership of the person who will design the Mishkan, which is Betzalel. Rabbi Yitzchak teaches that a ruler is not to be appointed without first consulting the community, and the general understanding is that the outcome should follow the will of the majority. In a contemporary context, we can say that when we have the right to vote for our elected officials, we also have the responsibility to vote and ensure others in our community vote as well, so that we know what the will of the community is, and that we express that will appropriately. There we go. Okay. Okay. More recently, this is we can do it. My tefillin for a ballot. Okay, wait, actually there's more. Yeah. Yeah. There's actually, I'm going to just go back. Actually, let me just go. Let's see if we have enough time. Yeah, I think we do. I'm going to go back a little bit because, through the Middle Ages, just again, unpacking this piece here from Talmud Brachot, through Middle Ages and approaching more contemporary times, the rabbis underscored an important balance in civic life. On the one hand, to follow the will of the majority, and also on the other hand, because again, like majority rule, that there could be the tyranny of the majority as well, right? So on the other hand, an obligation to also to participate in civic decision, even if, especially if one believes that the majority is wrong-headed. And so Rashi's, great Rashi, great rabbi and sage and commentator, Rashi's grandson, the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, emphasized the duty to speak out in a justice context if one thinks that the majority is in error. And he wrote this, the Rashbam wrote this in a commentary on Exodus, whatever, chapter 23, verse 2. And Rashbam wrote, if in your opinion the majority are about to commit an error in judgment, do not remain silent because they are the majority, but state your view. This applies even if you know beforehand that they will not accept your viewpoint, but that of the majority. Now, after that, it's like, okay, well, however, once one expresses one's opinion, there's still a requirement to lean towards the majority. And that's the rabbinic interpretation of 23.2. 13th century Talmudist Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, explained that once a communal decision is made, members generally have to follow the decision. Otherwise, there could be chaos. There'd be no communal agreement at all. And so there's a response there. And then, Amy, I'll get right to you on this. So it's a response, and I'll just quickly read this response. Regarding your question of whether 2 or 3 citizens in a city may remove themselves from a communal agreement or from a decree of cherem on something, know that regarding communal affairs, the Torah says lean towards the majority. It's a rabbinic translation of Shemot 23:2. Regarding any matter that the community agrees upon, go after the majority, and individuals must uphold everything that the majority decides for them. For if not, the community will never agree about anything if it was within the power of individuals to negate the agreement. Therefore, the Torah says, regarding everything, there's an agreement of the majority, lean towards the majority. This also gets set out in the Ramaz, a Polish, the 16th century halakhic authority, Rabbi Moshe Isserliz's commentary on Rabbi Joseph Caro's The Shulchan Aruch from Choshen Mishpat. The Rama says, for any community matter on which they cannot find common ground, they should convene all taxpayers, and they should agree that each will voice his view altruistically, literally for the sake of heaven, and they will follow the majority. And if the minority does not comply, the majority can force them. And again, there's source text all through all this is Exodus 23:2, which says, Lo tieh acharei rabim, you shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. And then so it continues. So again, there's still an underlying thing that, the will of majority is still based on sound foundations or sound principles. But then there is some need to have consensus at different points. Now, sorry, that was a lot. Amy, I see your hand is up.
Pass. So nice hearing everything you're saying, since helps communicate that people are supposed to listen 100%, and they are supposed to be able to make their perspectives known. I think you don't have to, and outright shouldn't sometimes, sit and silently condone anything. Simply because you're not a majority member doesn't mean, if everything's smooth at minimum, that you don't belong to the community at large. And you're supposed to have a chance to speak to anyone that has a heart. They should be able to listen, and as necessary, get it flipped. Come develop any understanding you can. It'd be pretty nice if something like that could happen, given how much crazy political shit is transpiring pretty much anywhere we look.
Thank you. And there's something there, in terms of the model here. I mean, if we look at the challenges that we have around the world, in our communities, around, again, dialectal thinking or talking or following each other or listening or even being, having the same understandings of what facts are or things like that too. It's there. I find a little bit of solace, or I find some solace in the fact that this is something that the rabbis, that are sages, and that people have been thinking about for centuries, as well. And there have been, some good models and some not as strong models of this over time. And I mean, in terms of the contemporary context, like how do we keep going? How do we not go up? And how do we follow, you know, the different things that we see here, and how do we continue to evolve it in a way that makes sense. We can do it. That's the message here, you know, on this next slide. And this is a beautiful story. You know, in the past years, Rabbi David Russo shared the story of a man who came before the Chazon Ish, who was a Russian-born Orthodox rabbi who spent his later years in Palestine, Israel, against pre and post creation of the state, to explain that he didn't have enough money to pay his taxes. Sorry, there's a typo there. Therefore, he would not be allowed to vote in an upcoming election, because in certain places, again, as election laws evolved, I mean, it used to be that women couldn't vote here, you know, in different places, you know, certain places you had to be a taxpayer to be able to vote and that sort of thing. Hearing the man's dilemma, the Chazon Ish responded, "You should sell your tefillin and pay the taxes. Tefillin you can borrow from another, but the right to vote you cannot get from someone else." And Rabbi David Russo also commented, you know, if the Chazon Ish was making a broader point, that elections impact the day-to-day lives of every person in society. Just like tefillin, our vote matters not only on the day of the election, but every day after it, until the next election. So thinking about the deeper import. You know, voting can seem like a small action, limited in time, but it has an impact that extends beyond the effort it takes to cast a ballot, and voting determines the direction of public policy, potentially impacting the lives of millions. And so he wrote that, I think, the mitzvah of voting, he wrote an article about it about 5 years, just over 5 years ago. Finally, you have Rabbi Moshe Feinstein writing in 1984. He's the great Orthodox halachic authority in the States. And he wrote, "On reaching the shores of the United States, Jews found a safe haven. The rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights have allowed us the freedom to practice our religion without interference and to live in this republic in safety. A fundamental principle of Judaism is hakarat hatov, recognizing benefits afforded us and giving expression to our appreciation. Therefore, it's incumbent upon each Jewish citizen to participate in the democratic system which safeguards the freedoms we enjoy. The most fundamental responsibility incumbent on each individual is to register and to vote. Therefore, I urge all members of the Jewish community to fulfill their obligations by registering as soon as possible and by voting. By this, we can express our appreciation and contribute to the continued security of our community." So here again, grounding voting in another Jewish value in the sense of hakarat hatov. So finally, just do it. These passages indicate that civic engagement through voting is a fundamental way to be involved in the welfare of our communities. Elections obviously have an impact on the everyday lives of every single one of us. For the governments we elect, develop policies and programs with local, national, and international implications. And here in Canada, the Supreme Court has observed that civic participation is fundamentally important to the health of a free and democratic society. So this here is a picture of our family. I mean, my God, my son is now Jake. He's now 12 and is a lot taller than I am. That's my partner Marcy, and it's our daughter Rebecca. She's almost my height now. So this was back in the 2019 election. A lot happens in 5 years, and so I think if we approach voting as not as one piece of that choosing life, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, it's beautiful. It's not perfect, and civic society is not perfect, but again, throughout the sources, I mean, I've just shared some of them. Throughout the sources, there are there's so much that we can share. I know we're at just over time. I feel like this is something that happens. And again, there are resources, at the end of the presentation, on that can be shared as well. Okay, there we go.
Let me say thank you to Rabbi Dara Lithwick. I will send out those resources to everybody who's registered, so you will receive the PowerPoint as well as the tshuva that she wrote. I want to thank our partners and our sponsors. I want to thank all of you for being here. This session will be posted to the Laasok YouTube channel, which I'm going to put in the chat right there. Feel free to check it out. And our next session in this social justice series is with Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz on December 9th on Borders and Migration, How Jewish Texts Can Guide Us on Immigration. And one last note, one last announcement, because Jewish tradition exhorts us to those who are in the States, go out and vote. It is a very important time to go do so. Thank you again to Rabbi Dara. Thanks for everybody for being here. Take care, everyone.